Then I shall commence recording. Also, before we start, and this is good to go on the record, are you guys having any trouble finding people to interview? Have you begun tracking down some people? Okay, good. Because that's, again, the kind of thing that you're dependent on the other person's schedule. And so I want you to be, working on that in advance so that you're not, 48 hours out and you can't find somebody. Because that is going to be an interesting paper. So my plan for today is that we're going to talk about the author of the book, the first chapter, and the chapter about the Civil Wargasm, which, wow. So how did you guys feel about this book? Is it going okay? Have you read through all the chapters? Not yet. That's okay. But you should read them as soon as you can, so this lecture will make more sense. Are you liking this book so far? Do you like it better than the last one? Thumbs up, excellent. Okay, I love this book. I think it's really good. And I think that it's like kind of a quick read because it's full of such strange things and such weird characters. But I'm really interested to see how you feel at the end of it because it's vastly different from the last book that we read. And it's also weirdly timely. I did not see any of this coming when I made this semester. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can look at the slideshow. So today, we are going to get started with Confederates in the Attic. So one of the things that I like to do, especially when we're getting into a new book for the first time, is sort of give you some background on the author and like the time period in which it was written, because that has a lot to do with what we write and what gets published. So first, here is Tony Horowitz. So he was a journalist, although he was also in part a historian. He was tremendously well educated. But one of the things that he did that he was really known for is what's called embedded journalism. So essentially he would go out to the place and like live with people and do their job and that sort of thing. So he wrote several pieces that were really famous in this regard. And this is one of them, really. So one of the things that he was, again, kind of known for was called barstool democracy, which is this idea that the way that we make connections in the world and the way that we make connections in politics is by hanging out, by talking, sort of metaphorically by sitting next to somebody and having a beer. And I think this is actually a very good way to reach people and to like begin to share opinions. I think this is actually a very healthy way to do things. So he was really famous for that. And he wrote several books that were sort of similar in theme to this one, which I'll tell you about in a second. And his initial article about the people who reenact especially the Confederate War, won a Pulitzer, so that's pretty cool. But he died very suddenly last year. He was like out for a run and had a heart attack and just, surprise, sort of died. So I think he's pretty great. A lot of his books are really good. If you got into this one, he's got some other ones. And there's him with some alpacas. I chose this picture because I'm kind of into alpacas lately. So one of his most famous books was called Baghdad Without a Map. So he is also married to another journalist, or rather he was, and they were both embedded war journalists. So very often when we talk about embedded journalism, we're talking about journalists who go with army troops. And they don't fight like medics, they're non-combatants, but they are literally embedded. They do all of the traveling, they do all of the like living. It's like a sort of a lived experience so that they go home and write about it so that people have a better understanding of what happened. So Baghdad Without a Map was one of his other like extremely famous books. And he also wrote about sailing voyages, like he was traveling the path that Magellan took, and he wrote about like low wage jobs, like he went and worked at like a chicken packing plant for a while. And of course, Southern heritage, he was pretty into that. But this is one of the things that one of the men that he was researching in Baghdad Without a Map said. He said, "You are very brave and maybe very stupid." Which sounds about right, doesn't it? Like that's, I think that's kind of what it takes to write a book like this. So this book is kind of old. Like it came out in 1998, and it caused a huge stir when it came out. It was like just a massive hit. It was a New York Times bestseller for sure, and like everybody read it. It was one of those books that sort of like crosses over from the sort of academic market into like the popular market, and so it was just a big old hit. It was like he did the whole talk show circuit. There's a lot of videos of him talking about it. You know, he's all over NPR, and in part because I think a lot of people, especially up north, had not realized that this was still a thing. I think in the South, we were sort of aware that the Confederacy was still with us in a lot of ways. But in other parts of the country and in other parts of the world, they didn't realize that so many Southern people were holding on to this war, you know, from 150 years ago. So it was sort of a cultural awakening, I think, for a lot of people, that this was something that was happening all over the South. The only people who had sort of a problem with it were the sons of Confederate veterans, and that's because of this one chapter that we're actually not going to read, although of course you can, about the last living Civil War widow. There's some question of whether her husband really was in the war at all. They might have fudged his records, so the sons of the Confederate veterans got real mad. So let's begin. So part of this book is essentially about the author's own relationship with the Civil War, and especially his relationship with both his father and his grandfather in terms of like how they spent time together and what they talked about. And so one of the first things that he introduces is this series of books, and it's called The Photographic History of the Civil War, and it contains a lot of photographs that we'll see later from Mathew Brady. But I thought it was kind of an interesting thing for him to reflect back on, that he spent a lot of time as a child looking at these pictures. And in a sense, that's a weird thing for a child to do. Like, we don't always tell children about war, especially that early. But in another sense, it's very normal. You know, I don't know what kind of toys y'all played with growing up, but you might have had, you know, little army men, or you might have like played soldiers in the backyard, or like very often our idea of war translates into children's games pretty easily, which is also kind of weird. Most video games are essentially, you know, first-person shooters or like battle royales. And so this idea of becoming obsessed with war when you're little is not wholly unusual, but it is kind of an odd choice, especially for recent immigrants. So his grandfather was a first-generation immigrant, came over from Russia, especially. There were a lot of Jewish immigrants in that specific time period, not just from Russia, but from a lot of places, especially in Eastern Europe, because the Holocaust was about to begin. So this was kind of a weird choice for a Russian Jewish immigrant, but there we are. And you can still buy these books. All of the pictures are in the public domain now because they're so old. But there are copies of these books still available. Although most of the time you can only buy one at a time, and they're like $75 each. I looked just in case. So essentially what happened was the author lives in Virginia, or lived in Virginia, sorry. And he saw some of the reenactors outside his house. It turns out he lives pretty close to a Civil War battlefield. And so he was just chilling, and he saw all these people, and he was like, what is this? What are you doing? And so he went outside to give them like water and food, which is exactly what everybody did when the real Civil War soldiers walked by. And so he got to know these people, and he got to know especially the guy that we're going to talk about in a second, Robert. And he became sort of curious about what they do, and being the kind of journalist that he is, he was like, I'm gonna go hang out. I'm gonna see what this is. So he goes to hang out with these dudes. And so what we're gonna start talking about now is the way that they get into the reenactments. And so I think that first chapter is one of the most interesting chapters in the whole book, because the whole time I was reading it, I was like, really? Really? There's just so many, like, but why? And so one of the most important things to them is authenticity. So one of the things that they talk about a lot is farbing, and I thought it was really interesting that nobody knows the like origin of the word, like the etymology of the word. But basically farbing is when you're historically inaccurate. So anybody who has like the wrong kind of watch, or if you remember, they made the author change his glasses. You have to have like all the right kind of clothing and that sort of thing. So like if you're in Civil War clothing, but then like you pull out your cell phone, a total farb move, totally unacceptable. And this is one of the ways that they sort of rank each other. So with all human groups are obsessed with ranking each other. And so their attention to farbing is really, really important, and their attention to hardcore as well. So basically, to farb is to do it inaccurately. This picture on the right is actually Robert Lee Hodge out reenacting, but with a laptop. But also the opposite of farbing is to be hardcore. So you might have noticed throughout the book, every time somebody would do something that they like particularly approved of, they would call it hardcore, or if it was amazing, super hardcore. And so there's sort of this designation of like doing it right and doing it wrong. And to be hardcore was the best thing you could be. It was like, it would be super authentic or super tough. Like every time somebody got injured, you know, that would be super hardcore. So this is important to remember, that basically they have these rules that they have designated for themselves, and they have these sort of like rankings that they have designated for themselves. The authenticity part is just like super important to them. And on the one hand, like, I get it. I respect it. Like, you're going to do a thing, do the thing. I think it's really interesting to like try to live authentically in that regard, even just for a weekend. Because you probably noticed when they were talking especially about the Civil Wargasm, how uncomfortable everything was. Like, you know, they're laying right on the ground in so many cases, they're eating all of this disgusting food. They did drink clean water, which was a good idea. But the authenticity is really, really interesting to me, especially in regard to the outfits. There's a whole network, as it turns out, like a sort of underground industry of people who make clothes for these people. There's a sort of like trade organization because it's so important to have as authentic as possible homespun cloth and handmade shirts and that sort of thing. So like a lot of people, essentially their wives get into it and make the outfits for them. So there's like a sort of cottage industry in that regard. And the other thing that I thought was so interesting was the sort of like low-key gayness. Like there was so much like spooning, so much like sharing, and like it didn't strike me as particularly like actively homosexual, but it was interesting the extent to which these men were like connected to one another, and physically connected to one another and emotionally connected to one another. And it's interesting because our like modern version of masculinity has gotten really far from that. Very often modern men like don't touch each other whatsoever. They certainly wouldn't spoon. But during the Civil War, that was like a whole different sort of definition of how men should interact. And to be fair, yes, of course, there was a lot of closet homosexuality. I saw a really interesting post recently, like a collection of pictures of friends from the Civil War. And I was like, yeah, those are not all friends. But most of these guys, to be fair, probably were hetero. They just didn't have the same sort of like social rules about touching or about nudity or about sharing and that sort of thing. So spooning was a really vital part of this. And you had to stay warm, you know? So I thought that was really interesting as well, like how much he hated spooning at first and then how much he gradually sort of was like, all right, like I guess this is who we are now. So I've never tried it. I've never been to a Civil War reenactment, but I think the focus on authenticity is actually really interesting, especially in regard to like what you're eating, because that part was super gross. So one of the ways that the reenactments sort of exist in the real world is that they sort of exist in direct contrast to what else is going on. So basically every time that they would do something really authentic, even when they were camping or when they were doing any kind of reenactment, they would attract all these onlookers. And I thought that was really interesting because again, I haven't necessarily seen that in person. Like I've never been like out in a park and seen people in the midst of reenacting, but I can imagine that you would be curious. And it turns out that this is one of the ways that they get members. People see them doing this sort of thing and they're like, what is this? And they ask questions and then they show up next weekend. So on the one hand, this kind of serves the function of educating people, because one of the things that they talked about a lot was how patient Robert was with all of the onlookers and how he would stay and answer all of the questions. But it's also, I think, a sort of demonstration of what it might have been like. So in the very, very last part of the book, I mean, no spoilers, but they are on like sort of one last reenactment. And one of the things that they notice is that the people who are there want to see them reenact because just looking at an empty battlefield doesn't have a lot of social meaning. So just like sort of standing there and being like, anyway, here's a field is a very different thing than seeing like how the field looks in comparison to these men and seeing how these men might have marched and what they would have worn. So the curiosity of the onlookers is like a major theme throughout the book, because the way that we think about the Civil War is so often super distant from the people that were there. So I think it was kind of interesting to see the way that especially children would walk up and ask all these questions. And I don't blame them. It is a weird thing to do. So weird. All right. So we skipped a lot of the sort of middle part of the book. And I chose to do that because, well, for one thing, I felt like we better focus. It's hard to get people to read anyway, might as well cut it down. But also because I think that this chapter sort of encapsulates everything that's weird about this book. There's a lot of, I mean, if you have time, read the whole book, it's amazing. But like this chapter is just like, what? So let's meet our main character. Here he is, Robert Lee Hodge. And again, if you have read this so far, what a bizarre human man. I sort of love him, like he's really harmless, I think, and he's into it, you know, but what a bizarre little human. So basically, when we meet him, it is 1996, and that's important to keep in mind. And so he's like really deeply into reenacting, and he's really deeply into authenticity, especially. And so over the course of the chapter, we get to know him a lot better, and really over the course of the book, we do as well. But he basically was raised in the North, but he had some family members from the South. And so even though this isn't like personal to him, even though he was raised like way up North, and this isn't something that's like part of his family history. This is just something that he felt a connection to, which I think is also extremely interesting. That's one of the things that we'll talk about tomorrow, like why people feel connected to this kind of thing. So basically, at the time, he was mostly a reenactor and like a model for portraits and paintings. But in the time since then, he's become a documentary filmmaker. He's made a couple of like movies himself, and he does a lot of like speeches and work for preservation. So if you Google him, like he's out there, like he's working hard. Nothing about him has changed. I'm concerned he may still not have washed his uniform, but he's like just one of those people who's just so deeply into this in a way that is bizarre to me, but I sort of enjoy him. So he's kind of the impetus for like the rest of the book. Like he's sort of the person who drives a lot of the action. So what they do is they go on this week-long road trip. And Robert has been on this road trip before. He's done it twice before with 2 different people. And I imagine he's done it since then with other people, but I don't know, he doesn't say it. And they call it the Civil Wargasm, which like, what? So basically what they want to do is see as many Civil War sites in 1 week as they can. And also they're driving the whole time. And again, bear in mind, this was before cell phones. I guess in 1996, a person might have had a cell phone, but it wasn't like normal. Like most of us didn't really get cell phones until maybe like 99 or so, maybe. So basically they're just like out there loose in the world with like a paper map, driving around in some car. And this picture on the left is them. I'm not positive if it's from the Wargasm or the next trip, but there they are, dressed in authentic clothes, trying their best to eat authentic food most of the time, just like out there for a week. And so there are different descriptions of it. Struck me as really interesting because Robert described it as dreamy, religious, a holy trek. So like for him, this is kind of like a holy trek. Like, you know, like people make these religious pilgrimages. For him, I think it kind of is that. I think it is sort of like a way of honoring the war, and a way of sort of honoring what happened, and a way of like fitting in as many like stimulus overload as possible. But for Tony, he describes it as a weird brew of road culture, rancid pork, and the quest for the elusive period rush. So it's a different goal for both of them heading out. But again, this is like an important part of embedded journalism. Sometimes you just have to like be on board with whatever's going to happen with the people that you're researching. And that's what he did. He was like, all right, like he buckled up for a week. So basically they set out, they're on the road, and the goal is to see as many things as possible. One of the things that they notice, and this is one of the things that I'd like to talk about in a discussion on Thursday, but one of the things that they notice is that they, I think, anticipated, or at least Tony anticipated going to see these fields, and they would just sort of like still be there, or there would be like historical markers, and instead it was largely like strip malls. You know, it's like car dealerships. Like it didn't look, I think, the way that he expected it to look, because a lot of these sites are protected, but a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are just fields, you know? And so for them to like go on purpose to try to find these places and have a really hard time, I thought was also really interesting, because the things that are important to them are not necessarily important to everybody else. So over and over and over, what they keep finding is this piece of land that they believe to be sacred is just not sacred for everybody. Like it's a Wendy's now, you know? So this sort of idea of how much land we should preserve historically is a major question that we're facing right now. And we're also, of course, facing the monument question, which we'll get to in a second. But this idea of like, if, you know, 14,000 men died in this field, should we just leave it alone, is a really American question, I think, something that we're really struggling with. So this picture on the right is actually part of a photo series that Robert and a couple of other guys did, where they essentially purposefully posed in front of 21st century things, but in their period garb. And it's a really beautiful photo series, but it's sort of about the difficulty of finding this authenticity in a modern world. And so this is one of their big struggles, because they were trying so hard to like live the way that those guys lived and walk where they walked, but a lot of that is subdivisions now. And so they had a difficult time with this. So this is, again, one of the questions that I want to discuss on Thursday, this idea of sacred land or sacred battlefields, and like what we owe to that war, and of course what we owe to the people who lost the war. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard about this, but this is one of the sites that they went and saw. So for a little while, Disney was going to make this theme park that was sort of like dedicated to American history. And it was called Disney's America. And to be fair, the whole thing wasn't Confederate. There were a lot of different things about it. But basically, Disney wanted to make a super patriotic theme park. And they wanted to make it here. You can sort of see they're at Manassas. And Manassas, by the way, is one of the battles that has two names, because very often the North and the South would use two different names for the same battle, which of course they did. But on the corner sort of next to Manassas here is where the site was. And so basically they announced it in 1993, and there was such an uproar. Everybody was like, no, you cannot, that they canceled it in 1994. So these were the plans. And so as you can see on the right, it's sort of dedicated to like epic moments in American history. So it's meant to be a sort of like a celebration. There's a lot of parts that are sort of about the World's Fair. And if you look at this plan for it on the left, you can see that it's broken into several different historical periods. Like it's not a Civil War park. There's a part about Native America, which I thought was really an interesting choice for Disney, because usually they're like, well, you know. There's a part about like the sort of beginning founding parts of America, like the founding fathers, our westward expansion, Manifest Destiny, the Industrial Revolution, and then of course there's, you know, the Victory Field is World War II. World War II went really well for us. We like to talk about that. And the state fairs, which I think are interesting. But of course, there was the Civil War for it. And so a lot of the pushback in regard to Disney's America had to do with the Civil War part. People were afraid that they were going to sort of glorify the war, or that they were going to like actively gloss over bad parts of American history, which we could be pretty sure that they were. And so all of this pushback basically convinced Disney not to make it after all. And so it could have been interesting, I think. And I think I would love to see a theme park that was accurate in this regard, like especially a theme park that had like accurate buildings and food and outfits and that sort of thing. But I think it's safe to say that any theme park they would build would be like super, you know, glossy, high level, like let's just not talk about the slaves, you know? So they never did build this park, but I think Disney's probably doing okay on money, if I understand correctly. So as they were out there, one of the things that Robert insisted on, at least when he could, was living in accurate conditions. And I wanted to show you at least a picture of sort of how they were doing this. So they had their camp roll, which most of the time was just like a wool blanket. If you were lucky, there'd be a gum blanket. I don't know if you saw those, but they're sort of like modern tarps, like they're sort of waterproof on one side and then like canvas on the other. So that would have been an amazing thing to have, because you could keep the dew off of you. But I think it's important to recognize that this is a terrible way to live. Like, and I love camping and I go camping regularly, but like to expect people to live this way, you know, for months and months and months at a time, especially with very little food, is rough. So in a way, I sort of admire the idea that they would go hardcore in this regard, that they would like actively suffer by like sleeping on the ground and getting cold. And Rob described a phlegm roll, which is when, after especially sleeping in damp and cold conditions, you get mucus essentially in your lungs that's really, really hard to cough out. And this was a real problem during the Civil War. This is one of the things we talked about some last week, or the week before, but a lot of the Civil War soldiers died of conditions and not of getting shot, you know. And so having this chest cold that you can't get rid of is authentic for them, but like literally deadly for the people who are there. But the way that he describes it, I thought was just tremendously interesting. So he says it's threadbare, famished, lice and dysentery ridden, yet for all that, romantic. And I think this is the thing. Like, this is why people become sort of obsessed with the Civil War and obsessed with reenacting it, is because even though it was outright gross and terrible, and again, most of the people died from just pooping themselves to death, there was still this sort of like romantic notion of the lost cause, or of like the gallant soldier, or of like doing the honorable thing. And so even though they're like purposefully putting themselves in awful conditions, and even though they're recognizing that the people who were in those conditions didn't enjoy that part, there's still this sort of like romantic notion of what it was like and what it was for and who was doing it. So for them, it was like a way of honoring, I think, what had happened before. But one of the other things that I am looking forward to discussing on Thursday is whether y'all would do this. And if so, why? And if not, why not? Because, again, it sounds terrible, but I do think that the idea of understanding what it must have been like for the soldiers could have some value. I think that people who declare war should have to try this first. So the next part, and by the way, like legitimate trigger warning, these pictures are real. The next part that they talk about is Mathew Brady. So Mathew Brady was one of the like well, actually, technically, he's basically the first war photographer, but he was one of the first people to like perfect the black and white photography, especially in regard to pictures done outside the studio. So what Mathew Brady did was he went to Civil War battle sites, like directly after the battles, and photographed the people. He photographed people who were still alive. He photographed people who were dead, and it was groundbreaking. Because bear in mind, with all of our wars before this, if you weren't there, you didn't know what it looked like. People did paintings, but people don't paint the dead. You know, people don't paint massacres. People don't paint fields with bodies on them. Like, people paint George Washington crossing the Delaware, you know what I mean? But they don't paint bloated corpses. And so for him to go out there and take these pictures of what was happening and of the people who were there and of the way that it really, really looked was groundbreaking. And it was also not something we let people do for a long time after that. Because what happened was people who weren't at the war saw what it looked like. And they were like, oh shit, this is terrible. And the secret with war has always been that it's terrible. We just don't tell the citizens about it. You know what I mean? Like, and this is one of the things that ultimately you may hear in your interview paper. But the big secret about war is that it's just awful. And we don't tell anyone that it's awful because we don't want people to know, because otherwise we would never go to war. And for a lot of people, because they don't want their families to worry or something, like, you know, they don't want to like upset people's delicate sensibilities. But for Mathew Brady to go out and photograph what was real and what was happening and what was happening to your sons when they go there was a real shock. And so on the one hand, it was really celebrated. People were really glad to see this. And on the other hand, it was really denigrated because people thought that it would have a negative impact on patriotism if people knew what happened, which I think is very telling. And so for 80 years after this, we didn't let anybody photograph dead soldiers. It wasn't really until the end of the Vietnam War that people were even allowed to photograph caskets coming off of the boats. Because during World War I and World War II, we had photography, but we didn't photograph battlefields, and we didn't photograph dead soldiers, and we didn't photograph coffins coming home. We didn't want people to see, you know, all of our dead sons and daughters returning from the battlefield. So Mathew Brady took all of these pictures, which we still have, and you can look them up, and they're stunning, I think. But again, they're dark. Because of all the death. But the fact that he did this and the fact that he showed people what it was really like was like a major moment in our history. And because it gave us so much sympathy for the soldiers, the Army like cut it out and wouldn't let anybody do it again for years and years. So these days you are still not supposed to. We have a lot of embedded journalists, but traditionally they are not supposed to photograph the dead. They're especially not supposed to photograph the American dead because it makes us uncomfortable, which it should. Okay, so here is one of Mathew Brady's films, and again, trigger warning, we're going to look at another one just here. So one of the things that they talked about, this is one of the trenches that they saw, that they went and visited on purpose, that Tony and Rob did. So this is one of the trenches where essentially they had dug into the ground behind the stone wall so that they could sort of poke their heads above the stone wall and shoot, but they had not anticipated the other troops coming in from behind. I think this is at Shenandoah. So basically, it was a massacre. And there were other massacres very similar to this. There was that other one where they dug the tunnels underneath and created that crater, and then all the Union soldiers got trapped in there, and then they just stood around the top and shot them. There's a photograph of that too. I did not show you that one. But I wanted to show it to you because it's so shocking. I think it's so realistic. Like, we don't look at photographs like this very often, and kind of I think that we should, because I think if we're going to go to war, we need to face war. We need to talk about what it's really like, and we need to talk about what we're sending those boys in to do. And so to see something like this, I think gives us a really good idea of what was really happening and what the situation was really like. And we're going to see a couple more photographs of this, especially later on in regard to the prisoner of war camps. But this was essentially what Mathew Brady did, was he went out into the field and shot real life, and then brought it home and published it. And so it was a game changer. So this photograph was also one of his. This is Stonewall Jackson. So after they talk about Mathew Brady's photographs in the diner, which was a great scene, they go and they visit the burial ground, at least in part, of Stonewall Jackson, at least his arm. So Stonewall Jackson is a really, really interesting Civil War character because, for one thing, I still can't remember his first name, although I assume that he had one. But he was given the name Stonewall because he was so, like, steadfast. Like, he would just do what he was going to do. Like, he would just, you know, come forward in the battle just like he was. And it was sort of unclear, the first person who called him Stonewall, whether they meant it as an insult or a compliment, because it could have been an insult. It could have been like, look at this bitch who doesn't see what's going on, you know, but it could have been a compliment, like, look at this brave man pushing forward. But we'll never know because that person died right after they said it. But basically, he was a really contradictory human. So he was religious. He was a very strict Presbyterian, and he was like a teetotaler for the most part. He drank some later on. He owned slaves, but he also taught slaves how to read during Bible school. So he was very contradictory. Like, he was very brave and very bold, but he was also afraid that if he ate pepper, his legs would fall off. Like, who is this guy? And he's going to become important later on in the story, especially too. We're going to go see a lot of his memorial stuff. But I wanted to show you this picture because, again, this is the first war that we have pictures of the people that fought, and I think this picture is particularly interesting. So he was, you know, sort of one of the Holy Trinity that we'll talk about later in terms of, like, Civil War generals. And you've probably heard of him, but he was an interesting dude. So at one point, for some reason, I thought the story was so funny. At one point, they go visit the place where his arm was cut off. So during a battle, he got shot pretty badly in the arm, and the doctor had to amputate his arm. But the doctor took his arm home and buried it in his own family graveyard, which, like, what a choice, right? So that's the, what do you call it, gravestone that they put on top of his arm. So they just stole his arm, basically, and took it home to his own house and buried it in his own family graveyard. And that was in 1863. So this is, like, getting on towards the end of the war. And then in 1921, a military veteran was visiting the family, and they were like, and that's where Stonewall Jackson's arm is buried. And he was like, bullshit. So he dug it up, and it was there. And then he was like, oh, my bad. And so he just put it back. What the hell, y'all? So it's still there, and actually you can still go visit it. I saw it has its own, you know, marker and everything on, like, Google Maps. And then there's another marker for the site of his amputation, which was during Chancellorsville. So the amputation probably didn't kill him, probably infection killed him, but it was a whole thing. So I don't know if you guys have seen these sort of markers, like this one here on the left, or sorry, on the bottom right. But if you're from the South, you probably have. These are everywhere, and I grew up ignoring them, as I imagine that you did. But they have put them up in a lot of places where, like, battles happened or where, like, epic incidents happened, and a lot of them are paid for by the Daughters of the Revolution, or sorry, the Daughters of the Confederacy or the Sons of the Confederacy. So if you've ever seen one of these, the next time you drive by one, you'll know what I'm talking about. You'll be like, oh, look, there it is. And one of the things that Tony noticed was that there were so many of these, like, everywhere, all over the place, that they felt like they were the last people to see them. Like, that no one had stopped and looked at them in a really long time. And that's probably true, because for most people, you just drive by these and you're like, yep, there is another one. So that's where Stonewall Jackson's arm is buried, if for some reason you like to go see it. So the next place that they go is to the Museum of the Confederacy. So the Museum of the Confederacy is attached to the house that they called the White House, even though it was a gray house. It was basically the Confederate president's house. And so this is where it starts to get a little bit weird for us. So at the beginning of the semester, I assigned this book. Over the course of the semester, a lot of things have happened to the people and the sites that are in this book. So as I was preparing this part of the lecture, it got really, really weird, because basically we're about to talk about the museum, or we're about to talk about the monuments, especially in Monument Row, and it's changing by the minute. So a lot of the pictures that we're going to look at for the next little bit, I'm going to try to show you a sort of a contrast between what they looked like and then what they looked like in the past, like, 2 weeks. So I didn't anticipate this class being so relevant, but here we are, and it's kind of exciting, like, in a weird way. Often core doesn't feel very relevant, but, like, look, it's so relevant, you know? So basically, a lot of the pictures that we're going to start to see in the next few slides are from the past 2 weeks, because these things have suddenly become part of our national attention again. So I hope that you did what we talked about the week before last, when I was saying to try to keep an eye on the news, because surprise, the news is about us, guys. So here is the Museum of the Confederacy, and it is currently closed. So this is one of the buildings that has recently been vandalized and has recently been protested. And so when they went here, this is, you know, essentially what it looks like. The front of the house is now sort of facing a hospital, I think, or an office building, because they built DC up around it, but, or sorry, Richmond, they built Richmond up around it. But that's essentially what it looks like in case you want to go there someday. And as you can see, it's got its own little historical marker here in front of it. And on the inside, Rob got really excited because there were a bunch of uniforms that he could poke and look at. And he really does know a lot about fabric and oxidation, which I thought was interesting. But this is another one of the things that I want to talk about on Thursday, this idea of, okay, but what should we do with Confederate artifacts, especially like, you know, these outfits and these flags? Like, I mean, I think they're in the right place, like the museum. I want to go look at them. I just don't want them, like, you know, in the town square. But this is like an important part of their journey because they're starting to really see things that are like right there in front of them. They're starting to really be able to look at the artifacts themselves and like closely examine them. So that was their first stop. And that stop made sense. Of course they go to the Museum of the Confederacy. Their second stop was the headquarters of the Daughters of the Confederacy. So we talked last week, or again, sorry, week before last, about the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So basically what they do, I think you don't have to be a blood relation to join, although that could be wrong. You might have to have had an ancestor who fought. But mostly what they do is raise funds and build monuments. So we looked at some of the monuments that they built last time, and that's kind of their whole jam, is the building of monuments. And this is their building. So in the book, Tony and Rob had a little bit of a hard time getting in because they were not members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And technically to get into their headquarters, you're supposed to be a member. But Rob raised a big fuss, and he's a member of Sons, the Confederacy, so they'll let them in. But it was really interesting, this conversation that they had with the woman who worked there, because basically she was kind of an intern, and she was not from Richmond, you know, like this was not part of her family's history. And she was really surprised that people still cared. And one of the things that she said was, up north, the war's over, not like here. Which, yep. And then this picture on the right is from 2 weeks ago. So this is one of the buildings that has also been, you know, vandalized and desecrated, if you will, and one of the buildings that is currently being protected by the National Guard, because this is one of the buildings that the protesters went after. So that's our first picture of the way that these things are changing. So one of the things that they dealt with when they were in Richmond and when they were, you know, going to these meetings and that sort of thing, was this idea that a person could have an identity as a Confederate. And again, this is one of the things that I'm interested to talk about on Thursday and see what you guys have seen about this and what you've read about this and maybe like who you know. Because this is something that's starting to sort of resurface, this idea that you could, even though you weren't a member of the Confederacy, because you would be dead, that you could have a sort of identity as a Confederate. So for instance, Rob describes himself as a liberal Confederate. And it's kind of unclear what that means. Like, does he believe in what the Confederacy believed in, or does he just like reenacting? Because at one point he says, I don't give a shit if my sister marries a black guy unless he's a farm. So Rob's got values. He's got his own value system, I guess. But I thought that was especially interesting, this idea that you could identify with parts of the group and then not identify with other parts of the group, like a sort of selective thing. Because at another meeting later on, they meet someone who describes himself as a Confederate American, which is, again, baffling on account of the Confederates didn't want to be American. Like that was their whole deal. But still, I thought really, really interesting. And so one of the things, again, that I'm interested in hearing from y'all is the extent to which you see people in your world who are kind of living this lifestyle, or the extent to which you see people who might identify this way, and like what that means, like what a person means when they say that sort of thing. This sweatshirt is for sale right now. Like I've seen a little bit of like Confederate flag stuff going up again, Confederate flag bikinis and that sort of thing. So I'm just very curious about what it means to have an identity as a Confederate in modern times, especially this month, if you will. So what we're going to look at now is Monument Avenue. So again, in terms of everything being hyper timely, in the book, they go to Monument Avenue, and this is it here on the right. I just wanted you to get sort of like a big picture view of what it might look like. That's the statue of Robert E. Lee here in the middle, and that statue is gigantic. I think it's at least 40 or 50 feet tall. It's very big in person. And basically it's sort of like a, you know, tree-lined avenue. Technically, avenues are supposed to have like something in the middle and then one traffic one way and one traffic the other. So basically the statues range all the way down the monuments, or sorry, the monuments, you know, go all the way down the avenue. And the Holy Trinity is all there, Lee and Jackson and Jefferson Davis. And then there's a couple of other guys who were just sort of also important, Jeb Stuart and Mathew Fontaine. So that's what it used to look like. Now let's look at the statues. So here's Robert E. Lee. And I wanted to show you this picture because it was also from, this one might be from 3 weeks ago or close to a month ago. But as you can see, people have been spray painting on that one. They've been going there as a site of protest. They've been projecting images on the monument, like and on the horse, which I think is kind of an interesting choice. And they're just, you know, they're out there actively protesting. So that statue, again, I also wanted to show you this picture because it gives you an idea of the scale. One of the things that's been happening is that people have been knocking down a lot of the statues, but they couldn't figure out how to knock this one down because it's gigantic. But this statue has been slated for removal. So in the last, I think it was about it's about 3 weeks ago, that they decided that they would remove the statue, but they're trying to figure out how. So basically it's been ordered. The removal of this statue has been ordered, but this statue is technically still there. And again, I think it might be an issue in regard to like cranes. That horse is probably real heavy. This is the statue of Stonewall Jackson. And it is also gigantic, but not quite as gigantic. It's probably about 20 or 30 feet tall. But there you see on the right, that was last week, y'all. So it was really strange because like I was going through and looking for these pictures to like sort of, you know, illustrate what they were looking at in the book. And I didn't anticipate that like essentially as I was looking for the pictures, this kind of thing would be happening. So last week, last Tuesday or Wednesday, they went and pulled that part of the statue down. And you can see on the right here that it's also, you know, there's a pretty strong amount of graffiti over there. There's a fence around it, but I imagine it would not be too difficult to scale that fence. So there's Stonewall Jackson and his horse, Sorrel, Little Sorrel. We'll see Little Sorrel in a second. Here is the statue of Jefferson Davis. And this one is also very, very, very tall. So this one was partially knocked down in June. So that's what it, again, used to look like. And I wanted to, again, to show you a picture so you could get an idea of the scale, because like the bottom part is probably about 20 feet tall, but the upper part goes up and up. So he is here in the middle, and that's Jefferson Davis, and that's the part that they knocked down. You can see it right there. They knocked it down on June 10th. The other part, I believe, is still standing, in part because it's so tall, but it's not supposed to be him on top. I think it's supposed to be the like physical manifestation of liberty, the way that we used to like draw women as manifestations of virtue. So there's Jefferson Davis, fell down, middle of the night. Here's Jeb Stuart, and as you can see, his statue also in the middle of being desecrated. So basically, again, here on the left, he's like in the middle of a traffic circle, kind of. So you can see him and his horse. I think that's actually a pretty good horse statue. But then over here on the right, you can see all of the people protesting. And so his statue is not currently slated for removal, but I would be surprised if it doesn't come down here in the next few minutes. It's also been subject to a lot of like a central protesting spot and a lot of graffiti and that sort of thing. Here is the statue of Mathew Fontaine Maury, and this was a very weird moment for me because as I was looking it up, they were removing it. So, like the news story had broken like 2 hours before I found this picture. So you can see him here at the bottom. That's supposed to be him, you know, thinking deep thoughts. And the weird part is this part. All of the people holding it up, there's a lot of, again, physical manifestations of like, you know, like liberty and virtue and honesty, but there's also a lot of slaves depicted here in this sort of like relief holding up the world, which is a weird choice. So they're literally in the middle of taking that one down right now as those little girls watch. In the book, they discussed whether or not, they went to a meeting to discuss whether or not they should put up a statue of Arthur Ashe. So I don't know if y'all remember Arthur Ashe because he was like way before your time, and I don't know if you play tennis, but he was a really famous tennis player, and he was especially famous because he was black. And for a long time, there like weren't any black tennis players. Like it was a really, really white sport. The Williams sisters changed a lot of that, but Arthur Ashe was you know, quite famous in the 80s and 90s. And so they wanted to put a statue of him on Monument Row, but they were trying to decide if they should because they couldn't decide if it was going to be contradictory. That's I think a really interesting part of that chapter, so I'm interested in hearing y'all think about that. But they did decide to put a statue of Arthur Ashe out there with all of the other sort of like heroes of Virginia, and it has also recently been desecrated. But as you can see, we're looking at a sort of reversal. So we're looking at a guy painting White Lives Matter on this one, and a lot of people went through and painted White Lives Matter, and then a lot of people went back through and painted Black Lives Matter on top of it. So in the same way that the other statues are being, you know, spray painted on, and people are sort of taking part in this movement, so too is this statue, which I think is really interesting. And also Arthur Ashe had nothing to do with any of this, but like, all right. I mean, I guess he kind of did. Anyway, we'll talk about it. So that's what's happening in Monument Row. All of that is real, and it's currently under stress. Later, he goes to this store, and this store is real, Olgers Store. So that's the guy that they talk about in the book. I love it when I can actually find pictures of these people. Sometimes I forget that the people in the books are real. And he is amazing. But yeah, that is his store, and it is sort of still like a Civil War museum. And this guy has never left his county. He left one time. He went on vacation to see the ocean one time, and otherwise he just sits there. He just sits on the front porch of his store, and people come by and they talk, and he just is there. So I think he's a great example, sort of on the one hand, like a keeper of history, and on the other hand, a person who's sort of stuck in time. I think he's a really interesting character in that regard, because on the one hand, like, is he hurting anybody? And on the other hand, like, damn, dude, what year is it, you know? So he argues that Southerners, a true Southerner, of which there aren't many left, are related to the land. So his argument is that Southerners and Confederates and the Civil War, that all of that is essentially focused on loving land, and loving your land and loving your home and wanting to keep it good and safe. And I thought it was really interesting because this echoes a lot of what we saw in Gone with the Wind, right? Remember how Gerald kept telling Scarlett, like, you know, land is the only thing that matters, and she keeps like clutching the land in her fist, and it's the whole thing. So I thought it was really interesting that he made a similar argument, that the only thing that Southerners really love is land, and they're just mad that you keep trying to take it away from them. So again, if we could go on field trips, that might be worth seeing. This part I also thought was very, very interesting. So shortly after they meet this guy, they go to a general store to like get some supplies, and it's like there's like nobody there. There's just one guy there playing pool, and he starts to talk to them because he can tell that they're Civil War reenactors, and they tell him about the Civil Wargasm and what they're doing. And he, I think, has some like really thoughtful and really critical and really interesting things to say, because he basically was like, yeah, you know, I've been waiting to ask somebody this question, and here's my question. So his question was basically, couldn't you have just talked about it? Like, couldn't you have just worked it out? You know, because his question was this idea of like brother fighting brother and like neighbors fighting neighbors. And he said that he grew up close to where one of the Civil War battlefields was, by Sailor's Creek. 6,000 dudes got hurt or killed 3 days before the war be finished, and for what? And I thought that his viewpoint on war was just kind of fascinating. This guy who was looking at it, you know, again, removed from it, like, you know, 150 years later, looking at it and thinking like, was this not a mistake? But then he sort of deepens his story, because it turns out that he is himself a veteran, and he was in the Gulf War. And he says what he's seen in the Gulf War made him realize that war is useless. The main man, Saddam, he's still there. It was politics and greed, same as in your war. Seems to me y'all could have worked it out. I was like, damn. So I think this is, again, like sort of a really fascinating viewpoint, because this was one of the things that Tony was struggling with as well, the author, this idea that, like, what were they fighting about, and why did they all go, and were these lives lost in vain? And for this guy, this like random guy who's just like playing pool in a gas station, to be like, yeah, what are y'all even doing? I thought was a really beautiful moment in the book, especially. So again, once we are able to gather together and I can hear you and see you, I'm interested to see what y'all thought about him. He never has a name, but I like him. So they are not necessarily going chronologically in the course of their Civil Wargasm, but one of the places that they visit is this house where the terms of surrender were negotiated. So that's the house there. You can go visit it too if you want to. But basically, Grant and Lee showed up, and they like sat in the parlor of this house, and they chatted for a minute, which I think is hilarious too, because they knew each other. They had both fought in the Mexican-American War together against the Mexicans. And so basically, they knew each other, and they were kind of, in a lot of ways, really similar people. Like they basically were men who had come from the same background and had the same job, you know. So they actually negotiated the terms quite peacefully. It wasn't a bloodbath in the end. It wasn't a dramatic, vast argument. It was like, you know, two dudes sort of sat down and they were like, all right, well, I guess this is over. And they negotiated their terms of surrender, which were pretty generous, all things considered. The soldiers on both sides got vouchers for the train, so they could ride the train all the way home. And on both sides got vouchers for food. And this is one of the things that we don't hear about a lot, because we hear these stories about like Confederate soldiers, you know, dragging their asses home with a crust of bread. And one of the things that they were talking about was that they all had vouchers to get food from the Union storehouses. So essentially, they argued that any Confederate who walked home to Alabama without a crust in his pocket probably did so out of pride rather than necessity. Which tracks, right? Like, pride was the whole deal. Being tough was the whole deal. Like, not taking, you know, handouts from the Union government was the whole deal. So even though the end of the war was quite peaceful and the negotiations were pretty fair, especially, you know, for a bunch of traitors, they were still given pretty reasonable terms of surrender. They were still given essentially a ride home and food to get there. So a lot of soldiers did walk home, but they did that essentially because they wanted to make a point, not because they had to, which again may sound familiar. So I thought these quotes were also kind of interesting. These are from both Grant and Lee. And I think that we think of the end of the war as being quite dramatic and terrible and bloody, and it was actually kind of chill. So Grant said that he felt depressed at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and so valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which people had ever fought. And I think this is a really beautiful summation of the war. They did fight hard, and they did fight valiantly, and they did believe in their cause. It was just a shitty cause. So like that's, I think, what a kind of an amazing thing for the general, you know, to say. Like, he recognizes their valor. He's just like, And then Lee basically said, look, y'all, we lost, and we need to be graceful, and we need to rejoin the nation, and we need to be patriots again. So he said, true patriotism sometimes requires of men to act contrary at one period to that which it does in another. The motive that impels them, the desire to do right, is precisely the same. And I think this is awfully fair for him to say, like, look, I know why we fought. We fought for what, you know, we believe to be right, but the truth is that we lost, and now we have to do what we believe to be right for our country again. So he basically said, like, yeah, we were trying to be patriotic with our, you know, our offshoot country, with our, you know, our Confederacy, but now we have to rejoin the Union, and we have to do right by the Union. So he's basically saying, like, look, we fought a good fight, but like, it's time to come back. Like, no more secession, no more us versus them. Like, it's time for us to be patriotic in regard to the United States of America. So in a sense, both of these men had this very, I think, adult way of looking at these things. They're basically like, yeah, we fought hard, but it's over. People haven't gotten that part yet, right? But there's this idea that, like, it's done now, and we need to be American citizens, and we need to be cool again. So this is something that I think a lot of Americans struggle with, especially losing and then coming back gracefully is a very difficult thing to do. In America, we teach, you know, each other and our children to talk a lot of shit, but we don't teach our children to, like, suffer losses gracefully. This is something that, like, people struggle with in, like, Little League baseball games, right, where they make them, like, slap each other's hands sort of, like, angrily. But this is the real struggle. So the last couple of things that I want to show you happened at sort of the end of this chapter. So they go to the Virginia Military Institute, which is still there. There's essentially the Virginia Military Institute, and there's another military institute where they send boys who are being bad to try to make them into, like, soldiers. But basically they are still there, and their initial role was to train officers for the war. So essentially you could enter into the military institutes, and then it would be like sort of a combination college and military training, and then when you graduated you would automatically be an officer. So when you join the Army, you join like with a step up, if that makes sense. So you don't join as like foot soldiers, you join as officers. So VMI is still there, and I think they have like a football team, they're around. But I just couldn't resist showing you these pictures. So on the left is little sorrel. I can't even like look at it too hard. They did such a bad job. And I mean, to be fair, like, I am no expert in taxidermy, but Jesus Christ, what have you done to that animal? Oh, poor little traveler, Sorrel. Okay, that's a little Sorrel. So he's there in that glass box, and you can go see him. And some of Stonewall Jackson's things are there too, his saddle and his coat and things like that. So he was one of their most famous graduates, and he was actually a professor at the Virginia Military Institute. So they kept a lot of his stuff because he's, like an important member of their community. And then here on the right is that statue of Robert E. Lee that they were talking about. So they took really, really precise measurements of him. Actually, I think right after he died, to make this, and this is supposed to be sort of him in repose, like this is supposed to be his resting place. He's not buried under there, but it's meant to be a monument, essentially, to like him and his work and his death. And I cannot look at little Sorrel anymore. I just feel so bad for him. Oh, he was a good pony. Okay. So essentially, this is kind of what happened over the course of the Civil Wargasm, but I wanted to show you those pictures to kind of give you an idea of what things look like, what they looked like then, and also what they look like today, because I did not anticipate them being quite so timely. But we're like literally in the middle of this right now, so I thought that was especially interesting. So, any questions about stuff from today? Let's see.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
So when the Union took over the Confederacy, did they view it as like a conquering or a defeat for the Confederacy? Or did the Union view it as like uniting a country?
That's a good question.
What were they thinking?
I think that Grant thought of it as a reuniting, but I don't think everybody did. I think a lot of people thought more the first version.
Had some like a little bit of like aggression and anger towards the South. They just wanted to obliterate them.
Not to obliterate, but to be clear that they had won and that there would be no more uprising.
Okay.
There is some question of whether they did a lot of things to like hold the South down economically, especially in regard to cotton trade, but that's more of an economics issue. I mean, I feel like I would have been mean if I'd been a Union soldier, but Grant seems to have been nice. Good. Any other questions for today? You guys are doing okay? All right, well, be careful out there. The governor has called in the National Guard. Because that'll help, is more guns. So what we're going to do tomorrow when we come back is talk about the parts that are specifically about Georgia, which I thought you might like because, it's personal. And also because they talk a lot about the Gone with the Wind and the power that Gone with the Wind has had. So I feel like that'll make more sense to you now. Now that you've seen the movie and we've talked about like the impact of the movie, I think that'll make a little bit more sense when they talk about the way that people are just obsessed with Gone with the Wind. Okay, you guys all right? All right, well, tomorrow we'll talk about Gone with the Wind. We're talking about Stone Mountain. I have found an amazing video of the laser show because I could not stand not showing it to you. And we'll talk about essentially more about these Confederate identities and like how people have made peace with it and like where people are at with that. All right, well, I will see you tomorrow. Stay dry, stay safe, read your book, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Have a good day, Dr. B.
Thanks.